How's everybody doing? I have here Chapter 4 of Book 1 of the Ranger's Apprentice, the Early Years series, the tournament at Gorlan. Let's go ahead and get into it. Both Halt and Crowley took an involuntary step back at the words. They exchanged a quick glance. Then Crowley asked, "Duncan? You can't mean Prince Duncan, the king's son?" The innkeeper regarded them with renewed interest. "The same," he said. "He's been in the north for the past few months with a gang of armed men. None of them the type you'd care to run into on a lonely country road." "Doing what?" Halt asked. The innkeeper switched his gaze to him. "Anything they please. Robbing, plundering, raiding farms, and running off sheep and cattle. Sometimes they move into a town or village for a week or so and terrorize the locals, demanding food and drink and lodging and paying nothing for it. And they make sure they take only the best," added another customer, a farmer by his clothes, who had risen from a nearby table to join the conversation. "But he's the king's son," Crowley protested. "He's the heir to the throne." "Then eventually we'll have a robber and a thief for a king," the innkeeper said. The farmer nodded agreement. The gods know what the old king makes of it all. He must be disgusted. Halt turned to Crowley. "This is the prince you said a man would be proud to follow?" Crowley shook his head, totally bewildered. "I don't understand," he said slowly. "I know Duncan. Not well, admittedly, but well enough to know that this is unlike him." The farmer nodded sympathetically. "I know what you mean. Up until a few months ago, I'd heard nothing but good about the prince. But now this." He let the sentence hang. "There's another thing," the innkeeper added. "He and his men have been raiding across the border." "Into Picta?" Crowley asked, barely able to believe his ears. The two villagers nodded. "Aye, they raid and burn, stealing cattle and horses. If anyone tries to stop them, they kill them." "But that's madness," Crowley said, his voice rising. "We have a treaty with the Scotti." He knew how long and hard the king had worked to establish that treaty. Duncan had actually handled some of the negotiations. Now the prince's actions, if they were hearing the truth, would endanger the fragile peace that existed between the two countries, provoking retaliatory raiding and killing. "It seems he cares nothing for that," the innkeeper said. "I suppose he assumes that if the Scotti start raiding back, he'll be safe behind the walls of Castle Araluen. We'll be the ones who'll bear the brunt of the trouble he's caused." "I don't believe this," Crowley said in a low voice. "I can't believe it. Why would he do such things?" "Power," said the farmer succinctly. "A man gets a little power, and he starts believing he can do whatever he pleases." "But Duncan? It's so unlike him. I can't believe it." "So you keep saying," said the farmer, "but it's the truth." Crowley made a hasty gesture of apology, aware that he might have offended the man. The farmer shrugged. He understood the stranger's consternation. "Any idea where he is at present?" Halt asked. The innkeeper looked toward one of the tables in the middle of the room. The other customers had all been following the conversation, and now he addressed one of them, a burly, gray-haired man. "Tom, what say you? You were up toward the border this week, weren't you?" The man he addressed nodded confirmation. "Aye, that I was. Last I heard, Duncan and his men were in Lindsay village. Been there several days, I heard. I left quickly. I had no wish to run into them. No need to, either," he added. "Where's this Lindsay village?" Halt asked. The innkeeper pursed his lips, then answered, "A day's ride from here. Longer, if the streams are flooded and the bridges are washed away. It's to the northeast, a few kilometers from the border." Halt took in the information, and placed a hand on Crowley's forearm. The ranger seemed stunned by what he had been hearing. "Come on," Halt said. "We need to talk." He looked at the innkeeper and the farmer. "Thanks for the information." The innkeeper shrugged away the thanks and held out his hand. "We didn't introduce ourselves," he said. "My name is Sharon." Halt took the hand. "I'm Halt." A smile touched Sharon's lips. "I thought you told Teasel your name was Arete or something." Halt smiled in his turn. "I thought you told him you had no lodgers," he replied. Then, turning, he led Crowley toward the door. They had a lot to discuss. The annex was warm and a little stuffy, and redolent with the smell of drying wool. Halt checked his cloak where it was spread over an armchair by the fire. The fabric was still slightly damp, but it was a big improvement on its former state. "Be dry by morning," he said, "and a good thing. We'd best be on our way." They had planned on staying for 2 nights, but Teasel's appearance, and the news they'd just received, dictated otherwise. Crowley was staring into the flames of the fire, his face set in grim lines. "There has to be some mistake," he said. "Prince Duncan isn't a thief or a bully. He's a fine young man, and he'll make a great king. A wise man once told me, don't believe anything you hear until you've seen it with your own eyes," Halt said. Crowley looked up at him. "Who said that? Pritchard?" It sounded like the sort of thing their old mentor might say. Halt affected to think for a few seconds, then gave a slight smile. "No, I think it was me, actually. I can be very wise at times." "This is no time for joking," Crowley said. "If this is true, our plans to revive the corps are finished. I was depending on a royal warrant from Duncan to give me the authority. If he's turned rogue, he won't be likely to give that sort of permission." His heart was heavy. He hadn't realized how much he was depending on Duncan's warrant to reform the Rangers. The idea had sustained him over the past weeks. Now he knew that Morgoth's enmity would spell an end to his time in the corps. Without Duncan to overrule the Baron, his plan was finished before it had even begun. "Then I suggest we ride north and see what's actually happening," Halt said. "Unless you simply want to give up, here and now." There was an element of challenge in the last few words, and Crowley reacted immediately to it. He looked up at Halt with an angry frown. Redheads, Halt thought. Quick to anger, quick to forgive. With an effort, Crowley forced down the anger. "You're right," he said. "We need to see for ourselves." Sharon gave them a hearty breakfast of thick, nourishing porridge laced with honey. He also provided a large pot of coffee, and Halt downed 3 cups in quick succession. The innkeeper raised his eyebrows. "Pity you don't like coffee," he said mildly. Halt shrugged. "We've been traveling on hard rations and cold water with all this rain. I'm making up for lost opportunities." They settled their bill with Sharon, and were on the road a few minutes after sunup. The clouds were breaking up, creating large patches of clear sky above them. In light of the drier weather, they had unpacked their bows, checked their strings, and restrung the weapons. With the long yew stave settled comfortably over his left shoulder, and the fletching of the arrows tickling the back of his neck from time to time, Halt felt more at ease than he had for the past week. They rode in silence. There was no point in discussing Duncan any further. Halt knew that any such conversation would mainly consist of Crowley repeating the fact that he couldn't believe the turn of events. And since there was no point to that topic, they remained silent. They had to detour several times, to bypass bridges that had washed away, or fords that were still running too deep to cross. The countryside around them steamed with the rainwater evaporating under the sun. It made for humid conditions, and by mid-morning they had discarded their cloaks, rolling them tightly and tying them behind their saddles. At noon they stopped for a quick meal. Sharon had provided them with a fresh-baked loaf of bread and slices of cured ham. They had also brought with them a supply of dry firewood and kindling from the stack in his stable. Halt built a fire and boiled water for coffee. He ate and drank with relish, enjoying the fresh food after the hard bread and dried beef they had been eating for days. Crowley didn't seem to notice the difference. He picked idly at his food and barely touched the coffee. His thoughts were elsewhere. By mid-afternoon, they realized they were getting close to Lindsay village. They had passed a fork in the road and descended into a small valley. Now, as they rode up to the ridge at the far side, Halt raised his head and sniffed experimentally. "Smoke," he said. "Do you smell it?" Crowley sniffed as well, then shrugged. "We must be nearly there. I imagine they have their kitchen fires alight." They crested the rise at that point, and looked across a shallow valley. Above the next ridge, a thick pall of smoke rose into the air. Halt shook his head, frowning. "That's more than a few cook fires," he said. "Come on." He urged his horse into a canter. No sense in galloping, and arriving with their horses exhausted. Crowley was a few strides behind him, and their horses' hoofs thudded dully on the damp mud and leaf mold that covered the road surface. Then they were into the trees at the bottom of the ridge, and weaving their way along the narrow path, riding in single file. As they rode up the far side of the valley, the trees thinned, and once more they became aware of the smell of wood smoke. Halt reined in as he reached the crest. The land here was an undulating series of ridges and valleys, and he looked down now into the valley that stretched out before them. The trees had been cleared here for farmland. He could make out 2 farmhouses, and, beyond, a huddle of buildings that had to be Lindsay village. That was the source of the smoke. Several houses, and a larger establishment that was probably the village inn, were burning fiercely. "Look there," Crowley said, pointing. Beyond the burning inn, a makeshift barricade had been thrown up, consisting of several carts and assorted furniture from the houses. It formed a small half-circle, its back secured by one of the larger houses. A small group of half a dozen men sheltered behind the barricade, thrusting desperately with spears, pikes, and in 2 cases, sickles on long poles, to repel a larger group who were trying to climb the barricade. For the moment, they were being forced back, but there must have been at least 3 times as many attackers as defenders, and it was only a matter of time before they overran the defenses. The attackers were armed with axes and long swords, with small wooden shields studded with metal. As they watched, Halt caught a glimpse of a swirling garment in red and blue checks. Tartan, he realized. "That's not Duncan," he said. "They're Scotty warriors." And that will be the end of chapter number 4. Thank you for joining me, and thank you all for listening. I will see you next time in chapter 5. God bless, and have a good one.